Welcome everyone, last day of Expo, last class. I'm excited to see so many people in here. My name's Lyle Tanner. I'm a nerd. I'm a big nerd on radio stuff. This is my 12th year attending the Expo, my 4th year teaching, and this will be our 3rd class this weekend on GMRS. Now, Midland is sponsoring the classroom and helped get us 3 classes, but I am not affiliated with Midland. I do use their products. They allow me to give feedback on their products and make things do improvements, but I'm not a Midland employee or affiliated with them. So, as I mentioned, I'm a professional technology nerd. I've been doing radio communications for over 31 years now, since I was a teenager, licensed FCC amateur radio operator. The company I work for, a Silicon Valley tech company, they send me to disaster zones to restore communications infrastructure, which is really cool. I love doing that because my original career was as a firefighter EMT. And so that's one of our assets there. I'm an Overlander. This is my truck. You can see my Starlink, a whole bunch of antennas. I've added another solar panel since then, but I get out all the time that I can. I've contributed to a book on Internet of Things, and I'm also a member of the Overland Expo Foundation. So if any of you were here last night for the raffle, that was the Overland Expo Foundation. All right, so today we're going to talk about the General Mobile Radio Service, GMRS, which is a radio service that allows us to very easily communicate with each other over various ranges. And the first question that always comes up is, well, what's the range? And so we're going to talk about the very first thing. We're going to talk about the rules of GMRS. They are pretty important. How you get a GMRS license, where it fits in with things like amateur radio, citizens band radio, et cetera. We're not going to talk a whole lot about that, but we are going to talk about those in relation to GMRS. We're going to talk about the basic physics of RF because it matters a lot when we're trying to get into the range. And we'll talk about privacy tones, also called CTCSS or DCS tones, and a little foreshadowing. They don't make your conversation private. They make it so you don't have to listen to your neighbor. I do have my GMRS repeater set up at the Expo. If you do have your GMRS license, I encourage you to try to use it. It's only putting out 2 watts of power. It covers the entire Expo, and it's a nice, easy way a safe way to try using a GMRS repeater where you're not worried about, am I going to get yelled at by somebody? It's my repeater. I own it. I operate it, and nobody outside the Expo is going to be able to hear you on it. So I encourage you to try it, and we're going to go through the details on that today. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about what features I actually use. One of the things I'm excited about on the new Midland radio is that it's actually easy to use. I have probably 20 to 25 different handheld GMRS radios because I'm just a nerd like that. A lot of them have like 70 menu options. I use like 8 menu options, and I'm an advanced user. And I have to look up with them. On the new Midland radio, they've actually optimized the menu a lot with some feedback so that it's actually user-friendly, or as user-friendly as an advanced radio can be. All right, so first thing always comes up is what's the range? So I have 2 real-world examples from my life experience as an Overlander. Here we have the north rim of the Grand Canyon. So this is the North Kaibab National Forest. This is North Temp Point over here, and this is Jump Up Point. The distance between these 2 points is about 20 miles. And then down here, I have Chiricahua National Monument, and we have the campground area over here, and then where my daughter and I were on a hike at over here. And this is a 2-mile distance on there. So in these examples, at this 20-mile distance, using a 5-watt handheld radio similar to this, spent, I don't know, 3 hours or so driving from here on 4x4 trails to get there. My wife and daughter stayed behind. Once I got to the jump up point here, and my best friend Andrew was there with me, called up on the radio and talked to my wife and daughter on my handheld and said, hey, we're at our destination. And they said, great, thanks for letting us know, across this 20-mile path here. And this is a cross-section of what the elevation looked like between point A and point B. And as you can see, we have a pretty good line of sight going across that. Now, there was a little tip here where we would have had to kind of do a bend over that from a radio signal, but we were able to talk 20 miles across that. Conversely, here in Chiricahua, we were down in a valley. My wife and my daughter, or sorry, my wife was down over here at the campground. My daughter and I were on the opposite side of this mountain. And as you can see, our line of sight was 2 miles of rock. Can you guess whether or not that worked? It did not work. Did not work at all. So what's the range? Is it 20 miles or is it 2 miles? It's line of sight. Excellent answer.
The emotion where
Yep.
let's see before line sights.
So let's talk about some of the rules, what we need to know. This QR code just takes you to the federal government's regulations for GMRS. The FCC, I'll turn down my radio. Somebody's testing the repeater. So the FCC manages all of the airwaves in the United States. They make it so that we can actually have working cell phones, satellite, ambulances, and fire trucks. They're able to respond everywhere because they set rules that everybody has to follow. And when everybody follows the rules, we're able to actually use the airwaves and get our signals through. If we didn't follow the rules, then we would have chaos and people's signals would interfere with each other and none of our stuff would work. So the FCC has a set of rules. It's called, so they regulate under Title 47, and then it's Part 95, Subpart E for GMRS. But basically, GMRS is set aside for people like you and I, regular people, that want to use two-way radio communications for recreating and doing non-money-making activities. So it's not for business purposes, it's for us to go out and recreate with. And they do it, a single license covers your entire family, defined by the FCC as your parents, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your children, your stepchildren, your in-laws. It's a very broad definition of family, are all covered under your FCC license. There's no test. It costs $35 for 10 years. Who else here has seen something at Overland Expo you can buy for $3.50 a year that's going to allow you to communicate 20 miles? That's the best deal in overlanding. I mean, it really is. Of course, you still need the equipment to do it, but there's no subscriptions involved. So other radio services are available to us as well. Today, our scope of this presentation is really GMRS, so Part 95. I'm also a ham radio operator or an amateur radio operator. That falls under Part 97. You have to pass different tests in order to get to that. You get a lot more power, a lot more frequencies you're able to use, but it is, everyone who uses it does require a license. My license doesn't cover my wife or my daughter. Each of us has to have our own license. If you start with GMRS and you're like, this is really cool, and you want to get advanced features and start tinkering, you might want to explore amateur radio as well. But amateur radio is more for facilitating it as a hobby than it is for practical communications because everybody does need to have a license. A couple of other things you need to know. So Part 95D is citizens band, so old CB radios. They run at like 27 megahertz. Those are pretty much kind of fading away. If you go to the Easter Jeep Safari, you'll find that you actually have to have a GMRS radio in order to participate in it. And CB radios are no longer allowed as an option from the rules in that event. There's two other categories we have. If you're going to do commercial activity, if you're going to make money by talking on the radio, maybe you're doing video production or you're selling products and you need to communicate between two people in order to facilitate that, you would want to look at one of these two license categories. So the multiple use radio service, which is what we call license by rule, which means you can just buy a blister pack of like Midland business radios and they have the licenses is basically built into the radio because they're low power. And then there's the commercial Part 90 licenses. So if you had a fleet of trucks and you needed to be able to talk, over a long range, ambulances, police cars fall under Part 90 as well, you might want to explore a Part 90 license. But today we're just talking about GMRS. So under GMRS, there's actually a subcategory that doesn't require a license, and it's called the Family Radio Service, FRS. And I've got the chart. We have 22 frequencies we're allowed to use. They are compatible with each other, but there are a couple little caveats here that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So you can go and you can pick up a blister pack from your favorite big box store of FRS-only radios. You don't need any license to use that. The license is built into the radio because it complies with the FCC rules for FRS. Now, if you want to use more power, you want to have a mobile radio, you want to have an antenna that's removable, you want to use repeaters, that's when you need to step up to GMRS. So I typically keep a couple FRS radios in my truck. They're great to hand to a spotter. I'll hand the radio to a spotter. They don't need a license to use that radio. And then I'm in my truck and I'll use my mobile, and they are compatible. You can see the one caveat here is that any radio that has a removable antenna is not allowed to operate on channels 8 through 14. So you'll see if you buy a GMRS mobile radio, you'll be like, what the heck? It's supposed to have 22 channels. Where'd 8 through 14 go? Well, the FCC says you can't sell or make a radio in the United States that has a removable antenna and operates on channels 8 through 14. So that's why you won't see channels 8 through 14 on those mobile radios that have removable antennas. It is, as I've kind of alluded to here, it's really important that we use type accepted and certified equipment from the FCC. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. If you are operating under GMRS rules, so if you're using your mobile radio, every 15 minutes of active communication, you do need to say your FCC call sign over the radio. That is part of the rules. And we're not allowed to do anything deceptive, false, misleading, or hidden messages, or encryption, scrambling of voice over GMRS. That's against the rules as well. So you won't find those features available in radios, but if we had made up our own coded messaging system to indicate whatever, that's actually technically against it. We need to speak in plain language, but it doesn't have to be English. If you speak Portuguese and your partner speaks Portuguese, you're allowed to use Portuguese. You just have to identify with your FCC call sign in English or in Morse code every 15 minutes. There's no whistling, no music, no advertising, and no one-way transmissions with one exception. The one-way, well, two exceptions. The one-way transmissions are for repeaters to automatically identify and for traveler aid services to be able. So somebody who had maybe a gas station in Death Valley could, by FCC rules, broadcast a message every so often that says, hey, you can come get water and fuel here, and we're the only stop for 100 miles. All right, I'm going to pause here. What questions do we have so far on rules? Question in the back. You're just out of compliance with the rules.
So what is that?
According to the FCC, they could seize your equipment, they could fine you a bunch of money, and they could put you in jail.
I'm taking this to understand that all, but you forgot.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like there is an FCC listening station every 10 miles monitoring this stuff. The bigger challenge that we get into, which is what we're going to talk about here in a minute, is using modified radio equipment. And this is a big problem and something that I make sure that we address. So I hear this all the time. The internet says I can just use a modified ham radio to use on GMRS frequencies. Well, will it work? Yes. Engineering-wise, if you modify ham radio, it'll transmit on those frequencies. Is it legal and ethical? Absolutely not. Does it put you at risk? 100% it puts you at risk, and it puts other people at risk too. And we're going to talk about that in a minute as to why. Because what if you didn't program your radio perfectly? Or what if you accidentally bumped the VFO knob or the keypad on that modified radio that can transmit on any frequency? And what if you set a repeater offset incorrectly? Well, let's take a look at this. This is a list of 4 frequencies. One of these is a GMRS frequency. The other 3 are not. Who thinks 462.525 is a GMRS frequency? Anyone?
Sure.
462.5625?
Sure.
Well, spoiler alert, if you had accidentally programmed your radio incorrectly, you might be talking on a frequency that's reserved and dedicated to the Arizona Department of Public Safety State Troopers. They have the best UHF network in the country. If you accidentally transmit on this frequency, I guarantee they will hear you. And that is not a good situation to have. You could be impeding somebody else's life safety by even accidentally transmitting on one of these frequencies. So just don't. I've never met a ham radio operator that didn't want to have more radios. So buy a GMRS radio and buy a ham radio. I have multiples of them. There's no need. We have great GMRS radio equipment. We have great ham radio equipment. The FCC says that they have to be kept separate. And so that's what we have to do. That's what the rules are. All right, so let's talk about some basics of radio frequency. We've all probably tuned our car stereo at some point in our life to an AM station, maybe 620, yep. And how was the audio quality on that? It was compared to maybe if we tuned to 101.5 FM, right? A little different on the audio quality there. Some of that has to do with the modulation type. So when we say AM, that means amplitude modulation, meaning that in order to send our voice, we're varying the amount of amplitude or power. And on FM, our frequency modulation, we're varying, guess what? The frequency. And on varying that frequency, we can get a little bit more encoding on it. But everything that we're talking about for GMRS is going to fall into UHF, which falls into our line of sight communications. When we get down into our high frequency or medium frequency, that's the area where CB operates and why you're able to get what you might have heard a skip before, where those frequencies can kind of bounce off of the atmosphere when it's charged by sunlight, and it can get a little bit further out there. But on UHF, all of our equipment we're talking about today, GMRS, all falls under UHF, and that is going to be direct line of sight. And so I mentioned this concept of frequency modulation, and we take the frequency, center frequency, and we modulate it either direction. That's how we encode our voice. And the way that we have good comms is by having a difference between the signal and the noise, which we call the signal-to-noise ratio, or the SNR. On your cell phone, you see that visually as a set of bars. What I'm showing here is a software-defined radio, and what that actually looks like on a spectrum analyzer of the difference between a poor signal and a good signal. And this matters because a bunch of our GMRS frequencies also are repeater frequencies. And repeaters usually sit on top of mountains and will put typically 50 watts of power output. And if I'm operating on a repeater frequency, but I'm not using that repeater, and maybe I'm talking with 5 watts of power on a handheld, and I have a privacy tone turned on, I may not realize that there's a huge noise floor happening behind me because the repeater is transmitting a signal on the same frequency, and that's raised by noise floor, so I need a lot more signal to overcome that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. All right, let me go back to this before I go to narrow and wideband. So you all can hear me very well right now because I'm speaking loudly and the room is quiet. If I were to keep my voice the same and everybody else in the room were to start talking, would it be harder to hear me? It would be. Our noise floor has raised. So if I'm on channel 20 on this radio here, and my GMRS repeater is operating on that same, and I've set my privacy tone so I can't hear that repeater, my repeater starts transmitting. Now me operating on channel 20 isn't going to go as far because that noise floor has been raised. Make sense? Same thing with the noise floor. So we can't control that background noise on there. I can't go and turn the repeater. Well, I can because it's mine, but you can't go and turn my repeater off. But you could change channels so that you have a lower noise floor and get better comms range. All right, so next thing we need to talk about, you'll see on radios, in fact, on this Midland radio, right on the front screen, it says W-band, which means wide band. GMRS radios are capable of doing both narrow and wide band. Typically, we're using wide. And this is just talking about how much of the spectrum it's using in that transmission. FRS radios will only do narrow band. And so what you might find is that you are trying to talk to somebody else. Maybe we've got 2 GMRS radios. We're talking just fine. Everything sounds great. And all of a sudden, somebody else in our party transmits. They've got all the right stuff, and we can hear them, but their audio is like half as loud. Well, that's a mismatch of the bandwidth on there. So if they're on an FRS radio, they can't change between wide and narrow. But on the GMRS radios, we can switch between wide and narrow. So we could actually switch our GMRS radios to narrow. We'd all sound the same. On the other side of it, if I had 3 FRS radios all talking to each other and a GMRS radio keyed up, the GMRS radio would sound way louder to those FRS radio users than the other ones, right? And so that's just a mismatch. It's just something we need to know. And we're starting to see this on repeaters now because the FCC made a rule change for commercial equipment several years ago that said that all commercial radios have to be narrowband. And typically the mountaintop repeaters are made from commercial radio equipment. They're fairly advanced repeaters. And so brand new repeaters oftentimes will be narrowband only when we look them up in a repeater directory. And so you just have to be aware, is the repeater wide or narrow? It'll work either way, but you might notice some volume differences in it. All right, so we mentioned line of sight. Now, contrary to popular internet conspiracy theories, the Earth is a sphere, and we know this for lots of reasons, but as it relates to this, it's really important to understand that that sphere impacts our range because of the radius of the Earth. If I transmit at this radio at 6 feet above the ground, in about 3.5 miles, this signal is going to be impacting the Earth because of the curvature of the Earth. So realistically, best case scenario, I'm out on open water, I'm on a sailboat, my buddy's on a sailboat that's 7 miles from me. That's going to be our max range holding those radios at kind of eye height. If we're going to talk further than that, how do we talk further than that?
Pressure.
Yep, we just got to get higher on one side or the other or both. Pretty straightforward. So we like to say for line of sight, height equals might. This also works with our cell phones as well. I'm sure all of you have been on a hike or somewhere before. You get to a high vantage point, and all of a sudden you've got cell phone service. You get down into a valley, you don't. Same concept applies there. Those are all line of sight also. So on the RF basics, we're going to continue this a little bit more. I'm going to talk about antenna radiation patterns. So this antenna, and by FCC rule, this antenna has to be what's called vertically polarized, which means my antenna should be straight up and down from a manufacturing perspective, and the signal is going to come out in these long lobes, kind of like a donut shape. And there's a null or a void at the top and the bottom of this antenna. So if I'm talking like this, I'm going to have the best possible range. If I go and I point my antenna at where I want to talk, I'm not going to get very far because there's no signal coming out of the end of this antenna. Now, with antenna gain, so I have, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I just want to demonstrate here. This is a higher gain antenna than this one. We don't get any more RF energy, but what we do is we focus that RF energy. So this red sphere gets kind of squished and the sides get pushed out. So it gives us better range by focusing that signal to go further out. And then I'm not able to talk as high or as low. Like if I'm up on a shelf road with a high gain antenna, I would actually have a poorer transmission signal to somebody down below than if I was using a low gain antenna. But I'm going to get much further out the distances. It's just like focusing, if you think of a water hose or a flashlight, same amount of energy, we're just focusing it in the direction that we want. Another really important thing to note is that polarity mismatches significantly degrade our performance. So unless we're on an overlanding rig, we're probably going to have an antenna like this or this, and they are going to be vertically polarized on that vehicle unless the vehicle's rolled over on its side. But normal communications is going to be straight up and down. So I'm going to cut my range effectively in half if I hold my radio sideways, because I now have a polarization mismatch. This antenna is now horizontally polarized. This one's vertically polarized. So for the maximum range, I need to keep my antennas with the same polarization. Now, that vehicle had rolled over, was sitting on its side. Maybe I'd want to hold my antenna on the side as well as I'm walking down the road to get help. But we always want to have a match between our antenna polarizations to get the maximum possible range. And there are so many times I see people holding their ears, and it's fine. Like if it's working for you in that range. But if you're trying to hit a repeater that's 20 miles away and you're holding like this and you're not in the repeater, turn your wrist 90 degrees and you're going to see a difference. And a good example of this is, anybody ever used a television with rabbit ears, an analog television with rabbit ears? Okay, anyone know how much power a TV transmitter puts out? Between 1 and 10 million watts, okay? You got these little rabbit ears, you're moving them like 6, 8 inches, and it's making a difference on the screen. Out of a 1 to 10 million watt transmitter that's on the mountain down the road there. So a lot of that has to do with that antenna polarization and you finding the sweet spot to match that. All right, so we talked about these antennas. You're going to see a couple numbers on here. So these all follow decibels, and we have 2 different references to that. So we have decibels per millivolt, which is the raw power output of a radio. So like this, let me find this radio over here. So I've got a Midland MXT 275 here. So this is a mobile radio. It puts 15 watts of power out. So on its spec sheet, it's going to say that its transmitter does 42 dBm, okay? So that's 42 dBm coming out of the back port of this. So if I had an antenna that had 0 gain, so that's going to be a 0 dBi, and it's decibels related to isotropic or just a no gain antenna. I would still be at 42 dBm. Now if I put a 3 dBi gain antenna on there, this 3 dBi gain, that's going to take me from 42 dBm to 45 dBm. So where does that fall on this chart? Any guesses? I couldn't hear you.
That would be treat.
Yeah, we're going to be about 30 watts of effective power on it. Now, if I swap this 3 dB antenna with this 6 dB antenna, where am I at in this chart now? I go from 42 dBm to 48 dBm. This is now acting the same effective power output as about a 55 watt radio with a zero gain antenna. So just by changing my antenna, I'm able to get more effective range, assuming that I'm still within the working plane of that antenna, right? So I'm squishing the signal. So again, if somebody's up on a shelf road up above me or below me, I may not have as good a signal to them, but if we're on the same horizontal plane, I'm gonna have a better range with this antenna. I'm focusing that energy, and I'm making this radio act like a 50 watt radio instead of acting like a 15 or 30 watt radio, all just by swapping out that antenna. All right, so when we're working with antennas, one thing that you just need to be aware of, if you're buying well-made commercial parts, it's usually not a problem, but it's possible that we can end up with a mismatch between the antenna and the radio and the antenna system, and that can degrade our performance. And so when we have that mismatch, we end up with what's called a standing wave ratio, and so part of that energy gets reflected back. Think of if you had a flashlight and you were to hold like a strip of paper like in the middle of the flashlight beam and some of that light's coming back in your face. Same kind of thing here. Not something you really need to worry about if you're buying commercial antenna systems and you're mounting things as they're supposed to, but you can start get into problems if you mount antennas too close to each other on the same plane, or if this is now in close contact with another large ferrous metal object. So maybe I had a huge steel box and I mounted this directly in front of it and I've got a couple inches there. That can mess with my standing wave ratio and reduce my efficiency of my antenna. If you want to check the efficiency of your antenna, there are various different meters that you can buy and put online. I've got one of these that I run. It's a SureCom. I think they're about $80, and it'll show you how much power is being reflected, how much is going through. But generally speaking, I've had really good luck. In fact, I was quite surprised when I set my repeater up when I got to the show on Thursday. I actually measured the SWR with this antenna sitting on top of my aluminum rooftop tent. I've got a clamshell rooftop tent, and I was measuring an SWR of 1 to 1.01, which is almost a perfect match. And so I actually didn't expect that. I was quite pleased with that result. And on standing wave ratio, if we don't have an antenna attached, we now have a unlimited standing wave ratio. All that energy is being reflected back into the radio, and it is possible to destroy a radio if you're transmitting on that. Now, if you just accidentally hit the transmit button, you're probably going to be fine. But if you press and hold the transmit button for 30 seconds, you're probably going to be buying a new radio.
Good. Thank you.
All right, so privacy codes. As I foreshadowed earlier, they don't make your conversation private. They filter out all the noise of everybody else around you. We only have 22 channels to operate on. On our mobiles, we lose 8 of those channels because we can't operate on the low power channels if we have a removable antenna. But we do have the ability to blank out some of that noise. So I imagine if you tried to use some radios this weekend here, you probably heard lots of other people if you didn't have privacy tones. I hear it all the time when I go to national parks, especially busy ones like Zion, where you're just hearing everybody talking about everything. And the way we filter that out is we have all of these privacy tones or privacy codes that we can configure on our radios. And there's 2 different technologies that are used. One's older, one's newer. They work about the same. CT-CSS is our kind of the older style, and DCS is the new. You don't really need to worry about which one's which. You just need to know that they're notated differently. So on our DCS codes, they're going to be a 3-digit code. They start at 023, and they go up to something in the 800s. And then on the PL tones or the CT-CS tones, they're usually a 3-digit number, 2 to 3-digit number, and they might have a decimal place in it. But on our radios, it's important to note that the manufacturers have not agreed upon a common set of numbers on the display. And so like on this radio here, this is actually operating on DCS 116, and I can see that when I open the menu on this radio, but on the screen it just says DCS 17. And now there actually isn't a DCS 17 code, but if I look up the menu on here on the manual, I'll find that the Midland DCS 17 code maps to the 116 DCS code. But if I had another brand radio I was trying to use on that same one, like for example, here's a Redivis, it would actually have to be code 18. And so why does this matter? Well, we don't control what radios other people use, and so we're meeting up with some friends, maybe we're convoying or caravanning on the highway, and somebody else has a different brand radio, and you're like, hey, let's be on channel 20, DCS code 17, and they set theirs to 17, and you guys can't hear each other, and you're like, what the heck? Well, that's what's going on, the user manual for both of those you'll want to reference to see what the actual underlying code is that you need to reference. I'm going to pause there. Does that make sense?
And take a photo of that, sorry.
Oh, of course, yeah. Oh, and by the way, so in the Overland Expo app, where you sign up for the class in there, you'll find that you can just, you'll see me as an instructor, primary email, just click on that. And if you want a copy of the slides, I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides. All I ask is that while you're in the app anyway, you just rate the session. Rate it whatever you think the rating is worth, and then I'm happy to send you a PDF of my slides.
Thank you.
All right, so now that we know the basics of RF, we know the basics of DCS and privacy codes, we can now start talking about repeaters. So what is a repeater? Why do we care about it? What do they do? I've got to go over a little bit of vocabulary here before we start. So everything we've been talking about so far has been about simplex communications. When I transmit and receive on the same frequency, that's simplex communications. So simplex is just referring to transmitting and receiving on the same frequency. When we transmit and receive on different frequencies for repeaters, we have what's called a repeater shift. And so in GMRS, it's a 5 megahertz difference between our transmitting and receiving frequency. And this matters because when we use a repeater, what it does is it takes our signal in on one frequency, and then it, at the same time, boosts the power and resends it out on a different frequency. And it couldn't work if it was on the same frequency. They have to be different frequencies because we have to have a separation of that RF energy in there. Another thing I want to just mention on here is that when we're talking on these radios, these are all what we call half duplex. It means we can only talk or listen at a time. So if somebody's talking on the radio and they're droning on about something, it does you no good to key up on your radio at the same time. It's just going to create noise. They're not going to hear it. Nobody's going to be able to hear anything. So these are half duplex. You do have to wait your turn to talk. You have to wait until the transmission is finished before you're able to talk. And the last important term, sometimes you'll see in repeater directories, they'll talk about an access tone. An access tone is just a privacy code, or a privacy tone, or a DCS tone, or a CT-CSS tone. We've got too many names for it, but an access tone is just another name for a privacy code. All right, so what is a repeater? So if I have, let's say that example, or let's use an example where I am out somewhere and I'm going to be a long ways away from the rest of my party, and I want to talk to them. Well, we know that height equals might in line of sight communications, but I can't exactly just instantly put myself on top of the mountain. But a repeater can put my signal instantly on the top of the mountain. So what a repeater does is it will typically be up at a high vantage point, oftentimes on mountaintops. Like here we've got Mount Eldon, where we've got a couple GMRS repeaters. And what they will do is they will listen to the surrounding area for a signal, and then they'll take it in, and then they will boost the power on it, and then transmit it from their high vantage point at a high power output over that entire area. So it's almost like I've been transported from a virtual radio perspective to the top of that mountain and have all of the range that that mountain could provide at that high line of sight. There are thousands of GMRS repeaters in the United States. I'm going to give you some resources. How do you find them? Some of them are open to anybody in the public to use. Some of them require that you're a member of a club in order to access it. And you'll find that in the repeater directories as well. There are even repeaters that are linked typically via an internet connection. so that you can even talk from, let's say, from Flagstaff to Denver. You could talk to somebody in Denver on a repeater in Flagstaff through a linked repeater system. And sometimes they even will be able to be dynamically linked. So you can say, oh, I'm on this repeater, and if I hit on a keypad a certain key of sequences, typically these are club repeaters that you have to be a member of, you can tell it you want to connect to another repeater in a far away location. One thing that we're going to go through, and you're going to see a demo of all the different possible scenarios. And so again, if you want a copy of the slides, just email me after the event. You can find my contact info in the app. We're going to go through all the different scenarios that you could run into in using a repeater, because there's this concept of split tones where our privacy code on our transmit is different than our privacy code on the receive. So I'm going to go through a real basic example of a repeater. So this would be no code repeater, just a basic repeater. So we've got this mountaintop repeater. This mountaintop repeater is listening on 467.675, and it's going to retransmit on 462.675. Now this is repeater channel 20. You don't need to memorize these. If you're buying a certified GMRS handheld radio that works with repeaters, it already has this pre-programmed in. On this Midland radio, I'm just going to repeater channel 20, and it already knows what to do here. So I've selected repeater channel 20, and when I transmit, I'm sending 467.675 to here, then it's simultaneously, it doesn't store the information and then play it back. It's doing it in real time, sending that out on that 462.675. And so right now, if I key up on here, so this is WQVJ426 testing. And then we'll hear the repeater beep at me acknowledging my signal. So in this example of calling...
Charlie Mike 541, you got me clear.
Awesome, thanks for the radio check. So in this example, I would be calling, my wife's name is Charlotte. If I wanted to call my wife, we have the same call sign because the FC says we only need one license. And so I would call her by name with my ID. That would come in the repeater this side in the red, and then it would, again, transform that to the green out the other side, and she would hear me on her radio if it was programmed correctly, right? It's also on repeater channel 20. All right, I'm gonna pause here. What questions do I have?
Some other radio geek giving me a big call with Liberty.
Yep, yeah, and so if anyone's been around the expo all weekend, I have my repeater every 10 minutes advertising its call sign and how you access the repeater. And I've been encouraging in all the classes to try it out so that you can get experience using with it. Because any equipment that we're not able to effectively use in the field is effectively ineffective equipment. So we have to have practice with our equipment, we have to use it, we have to have experience with it. And so the best way to do it is in a venue like this where, again, this repeater is only covering the expo, it's not going outside of it. So it's a safe place, you can make mistakes and learn. It's okay, you're not gonna get chewed out by some repeater owner because I'm the repeater owner. All right, so this was the basic repeater. This is before we add in privacy codes. So if I were to run this repeater like this, open without any privacy codes, I would get a whole bunch of people talking on here, stuff that didn't really want to have repeated out there. So my repeater right now, this is my current repeater setup, this is the exact same setup, and this is literally a photograph of this radio configured for this, and I took pictures as it was transmitting and receiving on here ahead of time. What we've done now is we simply added a matched set of tones, meaning my transmit tone and my receive tone, or my transmit privacy code and my receive privacy code are identical. This is the easiest type of repeater to use. Because all I do is in my radio, I go to repeater channel 20, I say my transmit DCS is 116, and then unless I tell it otherwise, I don't really need to do anything on the receive side, because it will automatically match it or it will leave none on there. So again, same concept. The only thing that's different in this flow is that I'm using DCS code 116 on the transmit and on the receive side of the radio. All right, now we're gonna get into some more complex scenarios that we will run into with repeaters out there. So the next one that's very common is we will have an input tone only. And this is technically a split tone repeater, because what's happening here is I'm transmitting, again, the repeater's still listening for DCS 116, but then it's stripping off that tone and retransmitting it with no tone. So if I had my radio configured in this previous setting where it's expecting privacy code 116, but now this other repeater that we're using doesn't send out a privacy code, what's this radio, what's gonna happen on this radio? Anyway, what's this radio gonna do? I have it configured to want to hear a privacy code on the radio, but the repeater's not sending a privacy code. So what's gonna happen?
Everybody key.
Where anybody with a privacy code configured isn't going to hear the repeater because there is no privacy code being sent out by the repeater. And so my configuration on this radio would be a transmit tone of 116 and then no tone on the receive side. You with me so far? Okay, I see some head nods, any head shaking? Okay, remember on privacy codes, they're how I filter out information, so I don't have to hear everybody else. So if my radio is configured incorrectly where it's wanting to transmit 116 and receive 116, but the repeater needs to hear 116 but strips off the 116 off the end, the repeater is no longer sending out a privacy tone, so I have to set my radio to no longer have a privacy tone on there in order to hear those transmissions. Which is the scenario I just went through here. Now, another common scenario is where we have a different tone on the output, a split tone. And so this could be, again, I'm sticking with the example of the repeaters accepting a 116 in order to talk to the repeater, and then on the other side of the repeater, it's replaced that 116 with a 23. And so, again, I would need to configure my radio so that when I'm transmitting with 116, but I'm expecting to hear 23 on the output side.
How do you know that?
I have to look at the repeater configuration. So when I look up in mygmrs.com or on repeaterbook.com, it says input tone, output tone, transmit tone, receive tone. And then that's where I configure that. All right, so those are all of the scenarios we're going to run into in directly using and accessing repeaters. Just as a quick summary, you are rarely going to come across a repeater that doesn't have any tones. You may run into repeaters that have matched tones. Those are the easiest ones to use. And then there's two different split tone scenarios you may run into. One where it requires a tone in and doesn't put a tone out. And then the last one where it is a different tone on the output side. But there's another scenario we need to talk about when we're configured for repeaters on our radios. So I'm transmitting and receiving on different frequencies on here, right? I'm transmitting on 467, and then the radio is listening on 462. Now, if I was on just non-repeater channel 20, what frequency am I transmitting and listening? I'm listening on the same, transmitting on the same that I'm listening on, which is the 462. So what can happen is maybe we're in a caravan, we're using a repeater, and all of a sudden, we no longer have access to that repeater. We're driving along the highway, we get out of range of the repeater, but we still need to talk to it. And I'm like, oh, shoot, hey, our turn's coming up. But I'm still on repeater channel 20. Well, I'm transmitting on 467, 675. But this radio is listening on 462, 675. We're on the same channel, repeater channel 20. We have the same DCS codes configured, but I'm not able to talk. Well, I'm not able to talk because I'm transmitting on a different frequency than what this is expecting to receive, because we're expecting to be using a repeater in this scenario. Real simple fix. I recognize this as the person that's doing that, so all I need to do is switch from repeater channel 20 to regular channel 20. I just turn the knob, go from repeater channel 20 to regular channel 20. Now I'm transmitting and receiving on the same frequency. Hey, buddy, I think we're out of range of the repeaters. Switch over to channel 20, standard channel 20, simplex channel 20, and they're able to hear me, and I'm able to make that switch. Make sense? I know, it's a lot. It's a lot. Like I said, you can, happy to send a copy of these slides to anybody that just send me an email. I'll send you access to the PDF.
Sure.
The way that we find our repeaters is we can go to mygmrs.com or we can go to repeaterbook.com. MyGMRS, I think, is a little friendlier of a user interface because it's got a map and you can click on it. And I've got an example here of a closed repeater. And you'll see, well, you may not be able to see from where you're sitting, but it says output tone is unlisted, input tone is unlisted, and that's because this is a club a members-only repeater, and so you don't get access to that information unless you're part of that club or pay those dues. The Seven Wonders repeater down here is an open repeater that's available to anybody, and if I were to click on this on the screen, it would show me what the input and output tones are. Now, a really important note, repeater etiquette, we do have to use our call sign. It is not only, it's FCC rules, the repeater owner can get in trouble if somebody isn't using their call sign when they're transmitting on that repeater. So if we're gonna come up on a repeater, we just need to say our call sign, and we have to say it at least once every 15 minutes that we're communicating. So maybe we communicate for 5 minutes, and we don't talk again for another hour. Well, I only have to transmit my call sign at first 5 minutes, and then an hour, 2 hours later when I want to transmit again. Just if I've had any communications of up to 15 minutes, I have to use my call sign during that period. How are we doing? Good. I see some heads nodding in the positive. All right. So I have a lot of GMRS radio equipment. What do I look for? What do I care about? You've heard my spiel already on why it's important to have Part 95 or GMRS certified equipment. The next thing that's really important, is it easy to use? I have a radio here. It's a fantastic radio. It's really cool radio. It's got a GPS receiver in it. It'll send the GPS information out. It's got an app that connects to its phone. I'm a very advanced user. It's a hard radio for me to use. It's a really cool radio. It's got a bunch of cool stuff on it. I wouldn't recommend it to most of you unless you came to me and say, hey, I'm a total nerd. I like to build Raspberry Pis and Arduinos at home. And I'd be like, okay, well, this might be a good radio for you. But unless that's you, this probably isn't the right fit. Conversely, my wife, this is the only radio she'll use. Has no buttons, has no screen. It has a volume knob and a dial to change channels. If I hand her a radio with a screen and knob on, she hands it back to me. So, is the radio easy to use for its intended users, including you? So you need to ask yourself that when you're making that radio selection, because if you can't use the radio effectively, it's no longer an effective piece of equipment. For me, I like radios that support repeaters because I use repeaters and I find them to be very helpful. And because I use repeaters, it's a must for me that they support split tones because most of the repeaters out there require split tones. It's not as important, but personally, I like to have a radio that can switch between wide and narrow for the reasons we talked about, as well as for some of the newer repeaters. I also prefer radios that are PC programmable because I can sit at home on the computer in a spreadsheet type interface and put all the repeaters in that I know I'm going to use on the weekend, plug the cable in, hit send, grab the next radio, do the same thing, and no minimal chance for any mistakes on any of that. I also really like radios that can be charged via USB. This radio doesn't have a USB port on it, but it does have a charging cup, like a cradle, that has USB on the back of it. So I can actually just charge this off a battery bank or anything else. And then I really do like having weather channels on my radios. It seems like a simple thing, but I personally don't use the weather alert as much, but I love to just be able to hit the button and be able to hear the weather. It gives me peace of mind that my radio is working. I can get a signal where I'm at, and I can get the weather information, which is also quite helpful. The last point on here, can you competently, consistently use it in the field? That's the point I've been droning on about. If we don't practice with our radios, we're gonna forget. We're gonna be challenged with using it in the field. So I mentioned that some of these radios, like this one has like 70 menu options in it. Well, really, what I use, these are the features on a radio that I actually use day in, day out, all the time. I change the volume, obviously power, volume, changing the channel, pretty obvious, my privacy tone, my transmit power, repeater, and repeater also would include split tones on that repeater configuration. And then the first thing I do on any new GMRS radio is I turn off the damn Roger beep. Can't stand that thing. So that's when you're talking and then at the end you hear bloop at the end of your transmission. That's just me. I like to turn that one off. You do you. But that's where I'm at. One thing I want to talk about, repeaters, you don't have to be able, if you want to use a repeater on your RV or on your overlanding vehicle, maybe you like to go out and do hikes, and maybe you're going to hike down into the Grand Canyon and you've got a nice overlook point. You can get these mobile GMRS repeaters. They're completely self-contained. It's got power in one side and a single antenna port on the other. And then this is your own personal repeater that you can use, which is really cool. From an FCC perspective, you are restricted. You can only use this with people that are under your license. So you couldn't use this with other license holders. So if you got a group of non-family members, technically they're not allowed to use the repeater because it doesn't have what's called automatic ID. And the FCC says you have to have that if people that aren't your license holder are going to access it. But this is great for, you're going to put it on top of your truck, you're going to go and do a hike, you got people going in different directions, and you can have your own personal repeater sitting out there. Yes, I'm ready for questions.
What was the model? Model one,
Yeah,
not bad on your handheld.
oh, on the handheld. Yeah, so here's the handheld here. This is the one that they just launched at the show. So Midland just launched this. It's the GXT67 Pro. And that's all the content I've got for you, so happy to answer any questions. We're the last class session, so I'm happy to stick around. If you don't want to ask a question in front of everybody and want to ask individually, I'm cool with that too.